Unraveling the Christine Jessop mystery, a story of loss, injustice, and redemption. This is Justice Delayed, the fight for truth in the Christine Jessop case, Part 2. Welcome back to Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast, part of our historical True Crime Tuesday series. I'm your host, Jay Nicoll, from Nicoll Investigations, and today we dive back into one of Canada's most haunting and pivotal cases, the murder of Christine Jessop. If you joined us for episode 1, you know the heartbreaking story of a 9-year-old girl who vanished from her small town of Queensville, Ontario on October 3rd, 1984. If you haven't listened yet, I encourage you to start there for the full context of this tragedy. So let's set the stage. On that crisp autumn afternoon, Christine Jessop stepped off her school bus, clutching a new recorder for music class, full of excitement to share it with her family. Her mother, Janet, and brother Kenny were out running errands. When they returned home around 4:10 p.m., Christine was gone. Her school bag sat on the kitchen counter, her coat hung unusually high in a peg, but there was no sign of her. What followed was one of the largest search efforts in Ontario's history. Hundreds of volunteers, police helicopters, and canine units scoured fields and forests, driven by hope that quickly turned to fear. On New Year's Eve 1984, that hope shattered. Christine's body was found 56 kilometers away in a wooded area near Sunderland. She'd been sexually assaulted and brutally stabbed. Her life stolen in a crime that shook Queensville to its core. The Durham Regional Police launched a massive investigation, and suspicion soon fell on a 25-year-old neighbor, Guy Paul Morin. A clarinet player and beekeeper lived next door to the Jessops. In April 1985, Morin was arrested, charged with first-degree murder based on little more than its proximity, a few questionable witness statements, and what police called his odd behavior. No direct evidence tied him to the crime, yet his life and the Jessops family's search for justice will be forever altered. In episode 1, we trace those frantic early days, the community's anguish, and the initial investigation's missteps. We left off with Morin's arrest, a moment that brought fleeting relief to a grieving town, set the stage for one of Canada's most notorious wrongful convictions. Today in episode 2, we pick up the story of Morin's 2 trials, a legal odyssey marked by flawed evidence and shattered lives. We'll explore his wrongful conviction, the groundbreaking DNA evidence that finally freed him, and the systematic failures laid bare by the Kaufman report. And we'll uncover how, 36 years after Christine's death, a stunning breakthrough in genetic genealogy revealed the true killer, a man named Calvin Hoover, who'd been hiding in plain sight. This is a story of loss that tore a family apart, an injustice that scarred an innocent man, and a relentless fight for truth that spanned decades. It's a reminder of the fragility of justice, and the resilience of those who seek it. For Christine's mother, Janet, her brother Kenny, and the entire Queensville community, the pain of her absence never faded. Their story and Morin's drive us forward as we unravel the fight for truth in the Christine Jessop case. So stay with us as we step in the courtroom for Guy Paul Morin's first trial, where a case built on shaky ground will spark a battle that changed Canadian justice forever. Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. It's a gripping true crime podcast uncovering unsolved murders, disappearances, and forgotten crimes from Ontario and beyond. Told with deep research, compelling storytelling, and a voice for the victims. Join us today, where every clue could lead to answers, and every case deserves a second look. The first trial of Guy Paul Morin. On January 7, 1986, the London, Ontario courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Inside, a 25-year-old clarinet player and beekeeper named Guy Paul Morin stood trial for the first-degree murder of his 9-year-old neighbor, Christine Jessop. The small town of Queensville, still reeling from Christine's brutal death 15 months earlier, watched closely, desperate for answers. For the Jessop family, Janet, Kenny, and their father Bob, the trial promised justice. For Morin and his parents, Alphonse and Ida, it was a fight to prove his innocence against a case built on whispers and shadows. The prosecution, led by Crown Attorney John Scott, faced a daunting task. They had no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, and no confession. Just a web of circumstantial evidence they hoped would convince the jury. At the heart of their case were alleged forensic links. A single hair found in Christine's necklace and fibers from her clothing that they claimed matched samples from Morin's beige Honda and his family's home. These findings, presented by experts from the Centre of Forensic Sciences in Toronto, sounded scientific, even damning to the jurors. A hair on a necklace, red threads from a sweater, beige filaments from a car. These were painted as threads tying Morin to a horrific crime. But there was a problem. In 1986, forensic science wasn't what it is today. Microscopic hair comparison was more art than science, relying on subjective judgment rather than definitive matches. Fibers, too, were problematic. Red wool and beige carpet threads weren't unique, and the Morins and Jessops lived next door, sharing a local laundromat. Contamination was a real risk, as samples were handled without the strict protocols we expect now. The defense, led by Toronto lawyer Clayton Ruby, hammered this point home. Ruby, known for taking on tough cases, argued that these so-called matches proved nothing. They were common, inconclusive, and open to error. Then there were the witnesses. The prosecution called neighbors who claimed Morin's behavior seemed suspicious. A gas station attendant said he looked jumpy hours after Christine vanished. Another neighbor swore they saw his beige Honda near the Jessop home around 4 o'clock p.m. on October 3, 1984. But these accounts were shaky. Timelines didn't align, and memories were foggy. Ruby pressed harder, pointing to Morin's alibi. On the day Christine disappeared, Morin was working as a finishing sander in a furniture factory in Woodbridge, Ontario, 40 kilometers away. His time card showed he clocked out at 3:32 p.m. With rush hour traffic, the drive to Queensville took at least 40 minutes, and he stopped to shop, likely at Upper Canada Mall, Newmarket, before arriving home no earlier than 4:14 p.m. Janet Jessop returned at 4:10 p.m. to find Christine gone. The math didn't add up. Morin couldn't have abducted her in that narrow window. The prosecution's boldest move was calling 2 jailhouse informants, Robert Dean May and a man known only as Mr. X. May, a career criminal with a history of fraud and assault, claimed Morin confessed to him while they shared a cell at Whitby Jail. He told the court Morin admitted to killing Christine in a fit of rage, saying he couldn't stop himself. Mr. X, later revealed to be an undercover police officer posing as an inmate, backed May's story, claiming he overheard the confession. But Ruby tore into their credibility. May was a diagnosed pathological liar who bragged about manipulating the system for reduced sentences. Mr. X's account lacked recordings or hard proof. His role as a police plant raised ethical questions. Ruby argued these men were opportunists, trading lies for leniency, not truth tellers seeking justice. For 12 days, the courtroom became a battleground of competing narratives. The prosecution painted Morin as a quiet oddball hiding a monstrous secret. The defense portrayed him as an innocent man, scapegoated for his quirks, his love of bees, his clarinet, his private family life. On February 7, 1986, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The room fell silent as the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Not guilty. For a moment, relief washed over Morin. His parents, watching from the gallery, exhaled years' worth of fear. But that relief was fleeting. Outside the courthouse, Crown prosecutors huddled, already planning their next move. They believed Morin was guilty and argued the trial judge, Archibald Craig, had given flawed instructions on reasonable doubt. Within weeks, on March 4, 1986, they filed an appeal, ensuring Morin's nightmare was far from over. The acquittal should have been the end, but for Guy Paul Morin, it was just the beginning of a longer, darker fight. Coming up, we'll step into the second trial, where new pressures and old mistakes would lead to a devastating conviction. Second trial and wrongful conviction. In the spring of 1987, the Ontario Court of Appeal handed down a decision that would prolong one of Canada's most wrenching legal battles. Guy Paul Morin, acquitted in 1986 of the murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessop, would face a second trial. The Crown had successfully argued that the original judge's instructions to the jury on reasonable doubt were flawed, and on June 5, 1987, a new trial was ordered. Morin appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, but in November 1988, his plea was dismissed. For the Morin family, Guy, his parents Alphonse and Ida, this was a gut punch. The quiet beekeeper from Queensville, Ontario, was thrust back into a legal nightmare, his freedom hanging by a thread. The second trial began on May 25, 1990, in a Toronto courtroom, but it would stretch over 2 years, becoming the longest murder trial in Canadian history at the time. Presiding was Judge James Donnelly, a respected figure known for his fairness, or so it seemed. The prosecution, now led by Leo McGuigan, with Susan McLean assisting, came armed with a bolstered case, determined to secure a conviction. For the Jessop family, Janet, Kenny, and Bob, still grappling with Christine's loss, this trial rekindled hope for closure. But for Morin, now defended by a new team led by Jack Pinkowski alongside Joanne McLean and Elizabeth Widner, was a fight for survival against a system increasingly stacked against him. The prosecution doubled down the circumstantial evidence from the first trial, recycling the same questionable forensic claims. They pointed to a hair in Christine's necklace and fibers from her clothing, allegedly matching samples from Morin's beige Honda and his family's home. These links, presented by experts from the Center of Forensic Sciences, sounded compelling to a jury unfamiliar with the limits of 1980s forensic science. But as we now know, microscopic hair comparison was notoriously subjective, and fiber matches were far from unique, especially for neighbors like the Morins and Jessops, who shared a local laundromat. Contamination risks loomed large, with lab protocols falling short of modern standards. Pinkowski's team hammered these weaknesses, calling their own forensic experts to expose the evidence as inconclusive. A house of cards built on shaky science. But the prosecution didn't stop there. They introduced a parade of new witnesses, each claiming to have seen or heard something incriminating. A police constable testified that the night Christine vanished, Morin seemed unconcerned when questioned at his home. A member of Morin's band recalled him speaking about Christine's death in a very uncaring way, as if it barely registered. Christine's best friend claimed that during casual chats, Morin gripped his hedge clippers so tightly his knuckles turned white, a detail meant to suggest menace. Neighbor Patty Hester said Morin once chased her away from his car where those alleged fibers were found. And in a chilling moment, Janet Jessop took the stand, her voice heavy with grief. She told the court But after Christine's funeral, she and several guests heard a man's voice screaming, "Help me! Help me! Oh God, help me!" She believed it was Morin, a cry of guilt echoing from next door. These accounts were powerful, but they were also deeply flawed. Many were inconsistent, surfacing years after the fact, shaped by fading memories and, in some cases, police prompting. Pinkowski challenged their reliability, arguing they were colored by Queensville's fear and desperation to pin the crime on someone, anyone. The prosecution leaned heavily on the concept of consciousness of guilt, suggesting Morin's quirks, his avoidance of police questions, his private nature, betrayed a hidden darkness. It was a narrative that played to emotion, not evidence, painting Morin as a monster because he didn't fit the small-town mold. The jailhouse informants from the first trial, Robert Dean May and Mr. X, returned, their stories polished to sound more credible. May, convicted fraudster with a history of lying, claimed Morin confessed to killing Christine in a moment of weakness. Mr. X, an undercover police officer posing as an inmate, backed him up, saying he overheard the admission. McGuigan framed them as reformed men, testifying out of civic duty, not for personal gain. A tactic that swayed the jury, as one juror later admitted, saying they went through hell to give evidence they didn't have to give. But Pinkowski exposed the truth. May was a pathological liar who bragged about gaming the system, and Mr. X's account lacked any recorded proof. Their testimony was a deal struck in the shadows, trading lies for leniency. Pinkowski's defense was relentless, uncovering a litany of investigative failures. A second autopsy in 1990, prompted by bones found at the crime scene by Kenny Jessop, revealed horrors missed in 1984. Christine's breastbone was severed, her vertebrae sheared, her face shattered, wounds that would have caused massive bleeding. Yet no blood was found at the Sunderland site. This suggested she was killed elsewhere, dumped later contradicting the prosecution's timeline that Morin drove her there directly. Evidence was mishandled or lost. The credit card receipt, red plastic bits, even soil samples from Christine's shoes could have traced her last steps. Sergeant Michael Mikolovsky, a York Regional Police officer, kept 2 notebooks, one suspiciously revised, hiding items like a milk carton found near her body. These lapses, Pinkowski argued, showed a case built on incompetence, not truth. But the courtroom wasn't a level playing field. Judge James Donnelly's bias became a silent force. He frequently interrupted Pinkowski, undermining his arguments while treating the prosecution with warmth. His jury instructions were devastating. Donnelly endorsed the Crown's flimsiest witnesses, downplayed the forensic evidence weaknesses, and even suggested a new theory, never raised by either side, that Christine was abducted from the street, not her home. This gutted Morin's alibi, which relied on the tight timeline of Janet's 4:10 p.m. return. He urged jurors to trust May and Mr. X, claiming they had nothing to gain by lying, despite clear evidence of their deals. And he dismissed Kenny Jessop's shocking testimony that 2 older boys had sexually abused Christine years earlier, a lead that could have pointed to other suspects. For 9 months, the trial ground on, a marathon of evidence and emotion. On July 30th, 1992, the jury returned after 9 days of deliberation. The Toronto courtroom was thick with tension, reporters scribbling, the Jessops holding their breath. The foreman stood, his voice steady. "We find the accused guilty of first-degree murder." Gas rippled through the gallery. Morin, pale but composed, stared ahead, his stoicism masking the weight of a life sentence. Janet Jessop's anguished cry pierced the silence, the mother's pain colliding with a fleeting sense of justice. Judge Donnelly fixed his gaze on Morin and intoned, "You are sentenced to life imprisonment without eligibility for parole for 25 years. As Morin was led away, the Jessops wept, believing the killer was caught. But the truth was slipping further away, buried under a verdict that would soon unravel. Guy Paul Morin was now a convicted murderer, his life stolen by a flawed system. But hope wasn't lost. Coming up, we'll explore how a scientific breakthrough would turn this tragedy on its head, proving Morin's innocence and exposing the cracks in Canadian justice. Exoneration through DNA. On July 30, 1992, Guy Paul Morin stood in a Toronto courtroom as the words, "guilty of first-degree murder," sealed his fate. Sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 25 years, the 25-year-old clarinet player from Queensville, Ontario, was branded a monster. A killer who'd sexually assaulted and murdered his 9-year-old neighbor, Christine Jessop. But Morin knew he was innocent. As he was led to Kingston Penitentiary, a spark of hope flickered, fueled by a growing movement determined to right this wrong. In this section, we explore how a scientific breakthrough, a single DNA test, shattered a decade-long miscarriage of justice and set Morin free, while exposing the cracks in a system that failed him, Christine, and her grieving family. The guilty verdict in Morin's second trial didn't silence his supporters. It ignited them. A grassroots group, the Justice for Guy Paul Morin Committee, formed almost immediately, rallying to clear his name. This group would soon evolve into the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, now known as Innocence Canada, a beacon for those unjustly imprisoned. At the forefront was James Lockyer, a tenacious lawyer who took up Morin's case with unrelenting resolve. Lockyer, alongside Morin's new defense team, including Jack Pinkowski, knew the case against him was built on sand, flawed forensics, unreliable witnesses, and a judge's bias that tipped the scales. Their mission was clear: overturn the conviction and prove Morin's innocence. The first step came on February 9, 1993, when Morin achieved something extraordinary. He was granted bail pending his appeal. Only the second person in Canada to secure bail after a first-degree murder conviction. For the first time in nearly 10 months, Morin walked free through the weight of suspicion still clung to him. Queensville, once his home, was now a place of whispers and sideways glances. His parents, Alphonse and Ida, stood by him, their modest home a fortress against a community torn by grief and doubt. But freedom on bail was fragile. Morin's fate hinged on an appeal scheduled for January 1995, and the defense needed something undeniable to dismantle the Crown's case. That something came from a quiet revolution in forensic science: DNA testing. In 1984, when Christine's body was found, semen stain on her underwear was preserved, a faint clue locked away at the Centre of Forensic Sciences in Toronto. Back then, DNA analysis was a distant dream. Labs relied on crude blood typing or microscopic comparisons that couldn't pinpoint a suspect. By the early 1990s, however, a new technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, had changed everything. PCR could amplify tiny DNA samples, making it possible to analyze degraded evidence like the semen stain from Christine's clothing. It was a leap from the guesswork of the 1980s, a tool that could speak the truth where human judgment had failed. Lockyer's team pushed for the semen sample to be tested, a gamble that could either clear Morin or cement his guilt. The Crown, confident in their conviction, agreed, hoping a match would silence the growing public outcry. As the appeal date loomed, scientists at the Center for Forensic Science worked meticulously, extracting DNA from the decades-old sample. On January 20th, 1995, just days before the appeal hearing, the results arrived, and they were seismic. The semen DNA did not belong to Guy Paul Morin. He was excluded as a contributor with absolute certainty, a scientific fact that unraveled the prosecution's entire case. On January 23, 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal convened in Toronto. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, advocates, and the Morin family waited in tense silence. Crown Prosecutor Robert Frater stood before the justices and delivered words rarely heard in a murder case. The evidence proves, as an indisputable scientific fact, that Mr. Morin is not guilty of the first-degree murder of Christine Jessop and should be acquitted. The words landed like a thunderclap. The court moved swiftly, setting aside Morin's conviction and entering an acquittal. Guy Paul Morin was free, not just on bail, but fully exonerated, his innocence etched in the unyielding language of science. Outside the courthouse, Morin faced a sea of cameras, his voice steady despite a decade of torment. "I never stopped believing the truth would come out," he said, a quiet testament to his resilience. The Crown issued a public apology, with Frater expressing deepest regret for all that Mr. Morin and his family had to endure. It was a bittersweet victory. Morin had spent nearly 10 months behind bars and almost a decade under suspicion, his life upended by a wrongful conviction. His family's savings were drained, their reputation battered. And for the Jessops, Janet, Kenny, and Bob, the acquittal meant the painful truth that Christine's real killer was still out there, their closure stolen by a system that got it so wrong. DNA had done what witnesses, fibers, and juries could not. It told the truth. But the question lingered. How had this happened? How had an innocent man been convicted of such a heinous crime? The answers would come. They required peeling back layers of failure, bias, and human error that ran deep in the investigation. Guy Paul Morin was free, but the fight for justice wasn't over. Coming up, we'll dive into the investigative and forensic mistakes that derailed this case from the start. Mistakes so profound, they'd spark a reckoning for Canadian justice. Investigative and forensic mistakes. On January 23, 1995, Guy Paul Morin walked out of a Toronto courtroom a free man. His innocence proven by a single DNA test that excluded him as Christine Jessop's killer. But the question lingered like a shadow over Queensville, Ontario. How had an innocent man been convicted of such a heinous crime? How had the Durham Regional Police, the Crown, and the courts gotten it so wrong? The answer lies in a cascade of investigative and forensic mistakes. Flaws so profound, they turned a search for justice into a miscarriage that stole years from Morin and left Christine's real killer free for decades. Next, we examine those failures from police tunnel vision to botched forensics and uncover how they derailed the truth in the Christine Jessop case. From the moment Christine vanished on October 3, 1984, the investigation took a fateful turn. Durham Regional Police, under pressure to solve a crime that horrified the tight-knit village of Queensville, zeroed in on Guy Paul Morin with a focus that bordered on obsession. Detective Bernie Fitzpatrick's notebook tells the story in stark terms. On February 14, 1985, after speaking with Christine's mother, Janet Jessop, he scribbled, "Guy Paul Morin, clarinet player, weird type guy. That offhand comment, prompted by Janet's casual remark about her neighbor's quirks, set the investigation on a narrow path. Morin, a 25-year-old beekeeper who lived next door, became the prime suspect, not because of evidence, but because he didn't fit the small-town mold. This was the start of what the Kaufman inquiry later called tunnel vision in staggering proportions. Instead of casting a wide net, police fixated on Morin, dismissing leads that pointed elsewhere. A neighbor reported seeing a white van idling near the Jessop home around the time Christine disappeared. Never followed up. A drifter spot at the local corner store days earlier was noted but ignored. And then there was Calvin Hoover, a family acquaintance who worked with Christine's father Bob and occasionally interacted with the Jessops. Hoover, in his 20s at the time, was known to some as odd. Yet police never questioned him directly. Only his wife, Heather, was briefly interviewed. These missed opportunities, buried under the rush to pin the crime on Morin, will haunt the case for 36 years. Other suspects slipped through the cracks. The defense later uncovered names like Dean McPhail, a cemetery worker with a history of sexual misconduct, and Brad Foster, a troubled teen who vanished after washing his delivery van the day after Christine's abduction. Foster's employer found it strange. He never cleaned the van before, yet scrubbed it with industrial detergent, seats and all. Then there was Bill LaRock, a knife-carrying youth known for sexual aggression. Each warranted scrutiny, but police brushed them aside, their eyes locked on Morin's clarinet and beehives. As a Kaufman report later noted, the investigation became a contest to prove Morin's guilt rather than search for the truth. The forensic work was equally troubled. When Christine's body was found December 31st, 1984 in a wooded area near Sunderland, the crime scene was mishandled from the start. No tent was erected to protect the evidence. No grid search was conducted. Officers tramped through the site, risking contamination, and failed to collect soil samples that could have clarified whether Christine was killed there or dumped later. A credit card receipt, a milk carton, and red plastic bits found near the body were either lost or hidden. Sergeant Michael Mikulski from York Regional Police kept 2 notebooks, one suspiciously revised, omitting these items. A swatch of carpet material vanished entirely. These lapses, uncovered years later, showed a disregard for basic evidence protocols. The autopsy was another failure, conducted by Dr. John Hilston Smith. It misestimated the time of death and missed critical injuries. A second autopsy in 1990, prompted by bones found by Kenny Jessop, revealed what the first overlooked. Christine's breastbone was severed, her vertebrae sheared, her facial bones shattered, wounds that would have caused massive bleeding, and no blood was found at the Sunderland site, suggesting she was killed elsewhere. This contradicted the prosecution's claim that Morin drove her directly to the field, but in 1984 these details were buried under sloppy science. The forensic evidence used against Morin was equally flawed. A single dark hair in Christine's necklace was deemed similar to Morin's, collected covertly by an undercover officer posing as a hairdressing student. Fibers from Christine's clothing, red wool, beige filaments, were linked to Morin's car and home, but the matches were subjective. Microscopic hair and fiber analysis, standard in the 1980s, lacked the rigor of modern DNA testing. Worse, the Center of Forensic Sciences hid contamination issues. Scientist Stephanie Neisneck later admitted fibers were mishandled, and 150 slides of hair and fiber samples along with lab sheets, were lost. As the coffin report stated, the similarities observed were equally explainable by random occurrence or environmental contamination. Yet these shaky findings were presented as damning proof. Then there were the jailhouse informants, Robert D. May, Mr. X, whose testimony helped convict Morin. May, convicted fraudster and self-admitted liar, claimed Morin confessed to him in Whitby jail, saying he killed Christine in a rage. Mr. X, an undercover police officer posing as an inmate, corroborated the story, but no recordings backed his claims. Both were offered reduced sentences, a deal May later bragged about. At the second trial, May admitted to friends he perjured himself. A psychologist diagnosed him as an egocentric liar. The coffin report condemned their use, noting that jailhouse informants motivated by personal gain contribute to over 15% of wrongful convictions overturned by DNA per the Innocence Project. Confirmation bias ran through every layer of the investigation. Police pressured Jan Jessop to adjust her timeline, shifting her return home from 4:10 p.m. to 4:30 to 4:40 p.m. to fit Morin's arrival. Witnesses influenced by police suggestions recalled incriminating details years later, like neighbor Patty Hester's claim that Morin chased her from his car, a story that surfaced only after police briefed her on forensic findings. As memory expert Dr. Elizabeth Loftus has said, human memory is particularly prone to misinformation. Over time, a truth to warp the case against Morin. These mistakes weren't just errors. They were a betrayal. For Christine's family, Janet, Kenny, and Bob, the investigation's failures meant years of false hope, believing Morin was the killer. For Morin, they meant a stolen decade, branded a murderer for a crime he didn't commit. The truth, buried under bias and incompetence, will require more than science to uncover it. It demanded a reckoning. The Christine Jessop case was a masterclass in what not to do in a murder investigation. Coming up, we'll explore the coffin report, a landmark inquiry that laid bare these failures and reshaped Canadian justice, paving the way for answers that were still decades away. The coffin report and its impact. In January 1985, Guy Paul Morin walked free. His innocence proven by a DNA test had shattered a decade-long wrongful conviction for the murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessop. But his exoneration wasn't just a personal victory. It was a glaring signal that something had gone terribly wrong in the Canadian justice system. How had an innocent man been branded a killer? Why had the real murderer slipped through the cracks? These questions demanded answers, not just for Morin or the Jessop family, Janet, Kenny, and Bob, but for every Canadian who trusted the system to deliver truth. In 1996, the Ontario government took a bold step, commissioning Justice Fred Kaufman to investigate the miscarriage of justice. Here we explore the Kaufman Report, a landmark inquiry that uncovered systematic failures and sparked reforms that reshaped Canadian law enforcement, offering hope that future tragedies could be prevented. On June 26, 1996, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario formally established the Kaufman Commission, tasking Justice Fred Kaufman, a respected Quebec judge known for his sharp legal mind, with dissecting the Christine Jessop case. Kaufman's mandate was clear: examine every facet of the investigation, trials, and conviction to understand how they went so wrong. Over 2 years, his team pored over thousands of documents, interviewed police, prosecutors, forensic scientists, and witnesses, and held public hearings that laid bare a troubling truth. When the report was released in April 1998, its findings were scathing. A 1,400-page indictment of a system that had failed not just Morin, but Christine and her family, whose quest for justice was derailed by those sworn to deliver it. The Coffin Report's central critique was tunnel vision, a single-minded and overly narrow focus that turned the investigation into, as Kaufman wrote, a contest to prove Morin's guilt rather than a search for the truth. From the moment Detective Bernie Fitzpatrick jotted Weird Type Guy next to Morin's name in February 1985, police locked onto him, ignoring leads that didn't fit their narrative. A white van seen near the Jessop home, a drifter at the corner store, and Calvin Hoover, a family friend who knew Christine, were all dismissed. Other suspects like Dean McPhail, Brad Foster, and Bill LaRock warranted scrutiny, but were sidelined. Kaufman called this tunnel vision staggering, a trap that mutually reinforced itself among police and prosecutors, blinding them to the real killer. Forensic science came under fire too. The report exposed a lack of oversight of the Center of Forensic Sciences, where hair and fiber evidence, central to Morin's conviction, was mishandled. A single hair in Christine's necklace and fibers from her clothing were linked to Morin's car and home, but these matches were subjective, overstated, and tainted by contamination. Scientist Stephanie Nisnak hid these issues, and critical samples, including 150 slides and lab sheets, were lost. Kaufman noted that hair comparison, once a courtroom staple, was inherently frail, contributing to wrongful convictions in cases like Morin's and others, such as James Driscoll and Kyle Unger. The report demanded stricter forensic standards, urging labs to embrace emerging DNA technology and transparency to avoid such errors. The misuse of jailhouse informants was another damning finding. Robert Dean May and Mr. X, the latter an undercover police officer, claimed Morin confessed to them, testimony that swayed the second trial's jury. But May was a diagnosed pathological liar who admitted to perjuring himself for reduced sentences, and Mr. X's account lacked recordings. Kaufman condemned these deals, citing Innocence Project data that informants contributed over 15% of DNA exonerated wrongful convictions. He called for significant limits on their use, a reform now reflected in Ontario's Crown's policy manual, which demands rigorous scrutiny of such testimony. Kaufman didn't spare the prosecutors or the judiciary. He criticized Crown attorneys for calling highly suspect evidence, losing sight of their duty to seek justice, not just convictions. Judge James Donnelly's bias during the second trial, favoring the prosecution and skewing jury instructions, was a silent force in Morin's conviction. The report's 119 recommendations were a blueprint for change. Mandatory recording of interrogations to prevent coercion, training to combat tunnel vision, and oversight to ensure forensic integrity. Many were adopted across Canada, from police protocols to Crown policies, reshaping how investigations and trials are conducted. For Guy Paul Morin, the report was vindication, but it came at a cost. In 1997, he received $1.25 million in compensation from the Ontario government, along with a public apology. But as Kaufman wrote, no amount can restore the years lost. Morin had spent nearly 10 months in prison. His reputation shattered, his family's savings drained. For the Jessops, Janet, Kenny, and Bob, the report was a painful reminder that Christine's killer remained free. Their closure delayed by a system that failed them too. Kaufman's words captured the tragedy. The real killer has not been found. The trail grows colder with each passing year. The Kaufman report wasn't just a critique. It was a call to action, a promise to learn from Christine's case. Its reforms aim to protect the innocent and honor victims, ensuring that justice, however delayed, could still be found. But the final piece of this puzzle, Christine's true killer, was still out there, waiting for science to catch up. The Kaufman report changed Canadian justice, but Christine Jessop killer remained a shadow until a breakthrough 36 years later. Coming up, we'll uncover how genetic genealogy finally named the man responsible, bringing bittersweet closure to a decades-long mystery. Identifying the true killer through genetic genealogy. For 36 years, the murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessop remained an open wound in Queensville, Ontario. After Guy Paul Morin's exoneration in 1995, the Durham Regional Police investigation stalled, leaving Christine's family, her mother Janet, brother Kenny, and father Bob without answers. The Kaufman report in 1998 exposed the failures that convicted an innocent man. But the real killer, the person who stole Christine's life on October 3, 1984, slipped through the cracks. Hope faded, but it never died. In the 2010s, a new tool, genetic genealogy, offered a chance to solve the unsolvable. Today we examine how Toronto police harness this groundbreaking science to identify Christine's true killer, a man named Calvin Hoover, closing a decades-long mystery in a moment of bittersweet triumph. By 2015, the Christine Jessop case had gone cold, its files gathering dust in police archives. But advances in forensic science were rewriting what was possible in old investigations. Toronto Police Service, which took over the case, saw an opportunity in genetic genealogy, a technique that combines DNA analysis with public genealogy databases to trace suspects through their relatives. The key was a semen sample found in Christine's underwear, preserved since 1984 at the Centre of Forensic Sciences in Toronto. That faint trace, too degraded for earlier tests, became a beacon of hope in the age of modern forensics. In 2019, investigators took a bold step. They extracted DNA from the semen sample and created a profile, which he uploaded to GED Match, a public genealogy database where people share their DNA to find distant relatives. Unlike traditional DNA databases used by police, which match profiles directly to known offenders, GED Match allowed detectives to search for partial matches, cousins, even distant ones, who shared snippets of the killer's DNA. It was a needle in a haystack approach, but it had cracked high-profile cases, like the Golden State Killer in 2018. The process was meticulous. Toronto police worked with genealogists to analyze the matches, building sprawling family trees that spanned generations. Each match was a clue, a branch leading closer to the suspect. By early 2020, their work converged on a name. Calvin Hoover, a Queensville resident who lived just miles from the Jessops in 1984. Hoover, born in 1956, was 28 at the time of the murder, a married man in his 20s with no criminal record, known to the Jessops through his wife Heather, a friend of Janet's. He'd worked with Christine's father, Bob, at an airline company, and had occasionally interacted with the family, even babysitting Christine and Kenny. Yet in 1984, police never questioned him directly. Their focus locked on Guy Paul Morin. Hoover was no longer alive to face justice. In 2015, at age 59, he died by suicide in Port Hope, Ontario, leaving behind a trail of questions. To confirm their findings, investigators needed his DNA. With a court order, they obtained tissue samples from Hoover's 2015 autopsy, preserved by the coroner's office. The Center of Forensic Sciences compared this DNA to the crime scene sample, and the results were staggering. A match with odds of 3 trillion to 1, a near certain confirmation that Calvin Hoover was Christine's killer. The man who'd raped and stabbed a 9-year-old girl had been hiding in plain sight, overlooked by an investigation consumed by tunnel vision. The identification of Calvin Hoover as Christine Jessop's killer in 2020 was a stunning breakthrough, but also cast a harsh light on missed opportunities in the original 1984 investigation. Hoover, a 28-year-old Queensville resident at the time of the murder, was never directly questioned by Durham Regional Police. Despite his close ties to the Jessop family, only his wife, Heather, was briefly interviewed. A fleeting note in the case files buried under the police's fixation on Guy Paul Morin. This oversight, driven by tunnel vision, allowed Hoover to fade in the background, his name absent from suspect lists even as he lived just miles from the crime scene. Hoover's connection to the area where Christine's body was found only deepens the tragedy that mischance. Christine's remains were discovered 56 kilometers away in a wooded field near Sunderland, a rural stretch of Durham region. Hoover, who worked with Christine's father Bob at an airline company, was familiar with the region's backroads. His job and social ties gave him knowledge of the area, including isolated spots like the field where Christine was left. The Coffin report later criticized police for failing to explore such connections, noting that the real killer likely knew the terrain well enough to choose a secluded dump site. Hoover's familiarity with Sunderland, coupled with his proximity to Queensville, made him a plausible suspect. If only police had looked his way. Perhaps most chilling is how Hoover likely knew Christine would be alone on October 3, 1984. As a family acquaintance, Hoover was no stranger to the Jessop's routines. His wife, Heather, was a friend of Janet Jessop. Hoover himself had occasionally babysat Christine and her brother Kenny. This gave him intimate knowledge of their schedules. When Janet and Bob were at work, when Kenny might be out, and when Christine would return from school. On that fateful day, Janet had told Christine she'd be late, running errands with Kenny, leaving the house empty when Christine stepped off the school bus at 3:45 p.m. Hoover, through his ties to the family, could have known this window of opportunity existed, a detail that made Christine vulnerable to his predatory intent. The thought that her killer exploited such trust is a heartbreaking twist in an already devastating story. On October 15, 2020, Toronto Police called a press conference at their headquarters, a moment 36 years in the making. Chief James Raymer faced the cameras, his voice steady but heavy with the case's weight. I'm pleased to announce that the person responsible for the murder of Christine Jessop has been identified as Calvin Hoover, he said. We now know with certainty who committed this heinous crime. The room buzzed with reporters' questions. But for those watching, Christine's family, Morin, and Queensville residents, the words landed differently. It was closure, not the kind that heals all wounds. For Kenny Jessop, now in his 50s, the news was bittersweet. Speaking to the media, he said, "It's a relief, but it doesn't bring her back. The pain never leaves." Janet, who carried the loss of her daughter through decades of false hope, stayed private, her grief a quiet constant. The Jessops learned that Hoover had been part of their circle, a betrayal that cut deep. His suicide in 2015 meant no arrest, no trial, no chance to face him in court. But the truth, uncovered by genetic genealogy, was a form of justice, a testament to science's power to right past wrongs. The breakthrough wasn't without debate. Genetic genealogy raised privacy concerns. Using public DNA database to catch criminals sparked questions about consent and ethics. Yet for cold cases like Christine's, it offered a lifeline, a way to find answers where traditional methods failed. The Toronto Police's success showed the world what was possible, giving hope to other families still waiting. But it also underscored a painful truth. If the 1984 investigation hadn't been so flawed, Hoover might have been caught sooner, sparing more than a decade of torment and the Jessops' years of uncertainty. Calvin Hoover's name closed a 36-year-old mystery. The journey to truth left scars that endure. Coming up, we'll reflect on what Christine's case means for justice and what it teaches us about the fight for answers. Reflection and conclusion. On October 15, 2020, the name Calvin Hoover echoed through a Toronto Police press conference, closing a 36-year mystery in the murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessop. For her family, her mother Janet, brother Kenny, and father Bob, the identification of Hoover as her killer brought a bittersweet form of closure, a truth long buried by a flawed investigation. Kenny Jessop, his voice heavy with decades of grief, captured the moment's weight. It's a relief, but it doesn't bring her back. As we close this chapter of Ontario Cold Cases, we reflect on Christine's memory, the enduring scars of this tragedy, and the lessons it holds for justice. A story of loss, injustice, and a hard-won redemption that reshaped Canadian law. Christine's story began on a crisp autumn day in 1984, when a vibrant girl with dreams of becoming a veterinarian vanished from Queensville, Ontario. Her brutal murder shattered a community and set off a chain of errors that convicted an innocent man, Guy Paul Morin. His exoneration in 1995, thanks to a DNA test that excluded him, was a triumph of science over human failing. But it was also a stark reminder of the cost. Nearly 10 months in prison, a decade under suspicion, and a family forever changed. The Coffin Report of 1998 laid bare these failures: tunnel vision, shoddy forensics, and unreliable informants. Its 119 recommendations sparked reforms: mandatory interrogation recordings, stricter forensic standards, and training to combat bias that ripple through Canadian law enforcement today. The identification of Calvin Hoover in 2020 through the cutting-edge tool of genetic genealogy was another victory for perseverance in technology. A semen sample preserved since 1984 led police to a man who lived among the Jessops, known their routines, and slipped through the cracks of a misdirected investigation. For Kenny and Janet, learning that Hoover, a family friend, betrayed their trust added a new layer of pain. His 2015 suicide meant no courtroom reckoning, but the truth offered a measure of peace, a chance to honor Christine's memory with certainty. This case is a cautionary tale, a reminder that justice systems must evolve to prioritize truth over expediency. The reforms born from Morin's ordeal, better forensics, fairer prosecutions, are a legacy of Christine's tragedy. But they're not enough. Wrongful convictions still happen. Cold cases still linger. That's why we tell these stories in Ontario Cold Cases. Christine's case teaches us that justice, however delayed, demands vigilance, courage, and the willingness to question what seems certain. So I urge you, our listeners, to keep this conversation alive. Support justice reform, whether through advocacy, learning about wrongful convictions, or exploring other unresolved cases in our province. Visit Innocence Canada's website to learn how you can help those wrongfully convicted. And check out our podcast archives for more Ontario cold cases that deserve answers. Share your thoughts on this episode in the comments or on social media. What struck you most about Christine's story? Your voice can spark change. Christine Jessop was more than a case number. She was a daughter, a sister, a dreamer whose life was stolen too soon. Her memory endures in the fight for truth, a quest that continues for every family still waiting. Thank you for joining us on this historical True Crime Tuesdays. I'm Jay Nicoll of Nicoll Investigations, and until next time, keep seeking justice, because every case deserves answers, and every victim deserves to be remembered. Thank you for listening. Subscribe now to Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. Episodes available wherever you get your podcasts.